I think here the focus shouldn't be how countries get to 16%, but rather to actually get their tax policies right. So basically, the 16 or whichever ratio or the right ratio to GDP will ultimately be achieved, but you know, with the right policies that actually encourage growth instead of actually, you know, killing growth. So to your question of, you know, the new property tax in Rwanda, it's generating very interesting debate. And, you know, from my perspective, I see it as a good thing if you put it in the context of Rwanda's growth story. Because we're moving from a point of no property to a point where there is taxable property. I think that's already a good point to, you know, say that, okay, because in a 20-year period after the Civil War and the deadly genocide, we are looking at people who actually now have some sensible property that government could even be considering to generate some taxable income. That's a good thing. It also means that we are actually expanding, you know, the tax base that the country has been, you know, relying on to generate most of the income it has used to do what everybody thinks is a wonderful story of, you know, developing Rwanda, you know, from the time of 1994 when everything was bad. So that's a good point to start with. But also, if you continue analyzing, you know, the impact of this property tax, it is going to balance the property ownership landscape in Rwanda. Because personally, I've been talking to property owners. I've talked to people who own more than 2 properties in the city center. And the conversation right now is they are looking to reduce their, you know, tax burden by selling off some of the property. For me, that's a good thing because it means you know, instead of having the property pool in the entire city held by a small group of people, now people, because they want to reduce or manage their tax burden, they are looking to sell off some of the properties they hold, which for me is a good balance for the economy. But you know, in the long term, yes, you have a question?
Right. Kenneth, I just want to pick up on that because if we're to look at the way this property tax is being structured, the residential tax is just over 1%, and the commercial buildings are just over just at 0.5%. This is at market value, and the residential buildings, this only applies if it is $35,000 and above. Now, this leaves me wondering, if a country is at a GDP per capita of just over $700, is this the time to actually be taxing residential property, or should they have some reprieve?
The answer is yes and no. Because if you look at the Kigali city landscape right now, there are neighborhoods where you'll find that probably there are people who can actually afford the 1% tax that the government is proposing. But there are also those that obviously without a doubt will struggle to actually pay that tax. So to your question, the answer is yes and no. Now, the question would now be, how are the tax authorities in this country going to roll out this new policy? If they do a blanket rollout, there is going to be a problem. You're going to have a bit of protests of people who already will be, you know, bring an argument that they already overtaxed. And also you have to look at how did people get to own the properties they have right now. Most of these are mortgages from local banks obtained at very high interest rates of averaging 17 or 16% over a 10 to 15-year period. That's a life sentence if you compare it to parts of the world where mortgage rates are at 2.0 or even 1%. So these are issues that are going to make it very difficult to implement, you know, this landmark taxation policy. But the question is, for those that can afford, how do you sieve them from those that cannot afford? Now, that's where the tax administration technicalities are going to come in, and it's going to be a headache, I can assure you.
Right, it really sounds like quite a bit of work. You've raised that life sentence there, the mortgage prime lending rate there being at 17%. Definitely, that's painful. But if we're to compare this to the rest of the region, if we're to look at Tanzania, which does tax buildings, and Kenya, which taxes land, Uganda taxing both, do we have an idea what the arrangement is going to be in Kigali?
I think everybody is going for the property tax because it's kind of easier. It's a more popular model. If you look around, you go to economies like the US, they prefer to tax property because it's more predictable. Because you're looking at what is there. Because in most cases, the reason to tax land, first of all, land, its value compared to developed land. Obviously, when you tax property, you're looking at a higher margin. Because a plot of land in Kigali is, will average at around 10,000 US dollars. Let's assume 10,000 to 15,000 US dollars. But if it's a developed plot of land, you're looking at that property probably tripling or, to a value of something like 60 million. Now, a tax return on undeveloped land of $10,000 to a tax return of a property of valued at around 50 million, which is probably $100,000. Obviously, the taxman is going to earn more from a property tax as opposed to taxing the land which is not developed. Now, moving forward, what I've seen emerging as a challenge in most municipalities in developed countries is the negative effect of property tax. There is a acronym called NIMBYism, not in my backyard. The debate is, if you pick a tax rate for neighborhood A, that is going to have a two-faced effect. One, it's going to have an effect on affordable housing in a way that if you're bringing a property development of what you would call affordable housing in an area where there is expensive housing, a pool of expensive housing, people are going to resist a cheaper, housing model because they're going to say you're going to attract a lower tax return, and normally that would mean the municipality will give you less services, assuming that government is collecting taxes to give you improved services from the local municipality. So there is a slight effect on people who are planning to develop affordable housing properties for majority of the urban dwellers. But it also have another side of the conversation where, for example, if you are in a neighborhood of affordable housing and somebody is proposing to put a high-end housing, high-end property development, and people are going to say, if you bring a high-end property in a neighborhood of affordable housing, you're going to force the municipal authorities to increase the tax rate, which is going to affect everybody and will force people to pay higher tax rate.